What kind of role should the United States play in the war between Israel and Hamas? Right now, many of the hundreds of American citizens stuck in Gaza are on their way back home after finally being allowed to cross the border into Egypt. The Palestinians that remain are now facing ground attacks from Israeli soldiers in addition to airstrikes, which have brought the death toll up to more than 9,000 people in Gaza. The situation there has prompted a top United Nations official to step down from his post, saying Israel is committing a, quote, textbook case of genocide while the international community turns a blind eye. Still, President Joe Biden is calling on Congress to pass billions in aid to Israel and urging Prime Minister Netanyahu to protect civilians in Gaza, while maintaining Israel's right to defend itself. He outlined his view of America's role in this war and others like it in a recent Oval Office address.
American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with.
Biden is the latest in a long line of American leaders who have seen this country as a moral authority for global conflicts, a controversial notion that has drawn a lot of pushback around the world and here at home, including from historian Andrew Bacevich. In a recent Boston Globe op-ed, he questioned Biden's view, asking, is the U.S. an indispensable nation or reckless and misguided? He's also the co-founder and board chair for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a professor emeritus of history at BU. He joins me now. Andrew, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, can you lay out what you think the United States' mistake is in its policy in Israel and maybe in Ukraine as well?
Well, I think the broader mistake, the error of judgment, was actually contained in that clip that you just played of the president. The assertion that we are called upon to be the global leader, and that endows upon the United States some kind of great moral authority. I think that when you examine our behavior, particularly since the end of the Cold War, particularly since 9/11, our own actions undermine the president's claims. And so the beginning of wisdom, to my mind, is to give up those claims and move to a more modest and realistic posture. Now, what would that mean with regard to Ukraine? What would that mean with regard to Gaza, Israel? It seems to me that acknowledging the difficulty and the complexities of those two conflicts, that we should exert ourselves to try to bring each of them to a close rather than adding fuel to extend them.
So, but just to push on this, let's start with Ukraine, perhaps. The U.S. could push to and bring the conflict to a close by cutting off Ukraine from American support. I mean, that would end in defeat for Ukraine, presumably, and a close. But that doesn't sound to me like what you're advocating.
No, I think that, and I'll be speaking in general terms here rather than specifics. But the origins of the Ukraine war, an unnecessary war, in my view. The origins of the war came from an unwillingness on the part of the United States and some of its allies to acknowledge that Russia does have a vital interests, has security interests. And those security interests require Russia to have some sense of not being surrounded by adversaries. NATO expansion was a disastrous undertaking by the United States. And the insistence of the United States that Ukraine should join NATO was the proximate cause of this war.
Andrew,
go ahead.
I'm just going to push you on that a little bit because my recollection of history is that the United States did not insist that Ukraine join NATO. It insisted at most that Ukraine should in future have the option of joining NATO. I don't think that's the same thing.
Well, it may not be the same thing, but it certainly rhymes. And I think given the aggressiveness with which the U.S. sponsored the eastward march of NATO to include, for example, incorporating the Baltic republics, former Soviet republics, incorporating them into NATO, it would be reasonable, I think, for Russian leaders to conclude that Ukraine is next on the hit list. And they have made very clear over a period of years that they consider that to be a basis for going to war. I'm not justifying anything Putin has done. He's a criminal. He is certainly not a friend to freedom and democracy, but it's pretty understandable if you look at it from Russia's point of view, how they have behaved. And I think the general point here is that we have not looked at the situation from the other guy's point of view. One might even say the same thing with regard to Gaza, Israel, that very few people in official Washington stepped back and said, well, I wonder how the residents of Gaza might react if the conditions locking them Gazans up in this small piece of territory, if those conditions persist. We didn't ask the question. Apparently the Israelis didn't ask the question. And so we've all been shocked and surprised.
So I think this question of, understanding the world from the other side's point of view seems like a critical hinge here. But it seems like there's a third party, to stick to Russia and the Russia and Ukraine for a second, which is the Ukrainians' point of view. Because surely their vote, and they seem to really, really not want to be part of the Russian sphere of influence, also has something to say here, right?
Absolutely. And, and if I were a Ukrainian, if that's where my loyalty lay, I might sign up to that proposition. But I'm an American, and my primary interest is the security and well-being of the United States. I think that ought to be the primary consideration of President Biden. And it seems to me that, and not just Biden, but his predecessor as well, that the course of action that we have followed has tended to lose sight of our own interests, of our own security, of our own well-being. We end up being involved in more wars than we need, many of which have done great harm to the United States.
So to shift the lens, so there's a huge gap in policy between the invasion of Iraq and funneling weapons to Ukraine or to Israel. So in the case of the Israel, right, what would the more restrained policy that you're advocating look like?
Well, there's no question that it doesn't matter what I say on this point. The United States is going to continue to provide the wherewithal to Israel to help it in the conduct of its war. That's I think, a given. And we'll see how the Congress acts on that, but I think it's going to continue to happen. There's pretty good evidence that after the president's, we will be with you forever rhetoric, that immediately followed the Gaza terrorist attack, I think there's pretty good evidence that there's some rethinking going on in Washington, and that the notion of trying to exert some amount of restraint on Israel's conduct of the war, that idea is gaining favor. I think it's a good idea, partly from a humanitarian point of view, partly because, however difficult it may be, we absolutely need to find some path to bring this war to an end for our own security interests, for strategic reasons. And therefore, toning down the level of violence is, I think, a first preliminary step in that direction. That needs to happen.
So I want to keep pushing on that. What does toning down the level of violence look like in the wake of the Hamas attacks, right? If the Israeli government sees the largest death of Jews in any day since the Holocaust, I think it would be difficult for the U.S. government to say, well, you should not respond to that. You should allow the...
and nobody has suggested that. I mean, they have responded vigorously, to put it mildly.
So I guess what I'm asking is there a line where you'd say this is too much? Or where we should back, like what specifically should the U.S. government be telling the Israelis to do or not do?
I think some of that telling is going on right now. Mm-hmm. That as far as we can tell, as distant observers, watching TV, the conditions inside Gaza, which were never good, are now horrific, and therefore something needs to be done to try to rein in the level of violence. I personally think we have very limited leverage with Israel. On any matter that touches on Israeli national security, they insist upon exercising an enormous level of autonomy. Nonetheless, we need to do our best to try to curb the level of violence as a preliminary step towards finding a way to ending the conflict.
Okay, so, and then in both of these, Andrew, you sort of mentioned that you didn't like this sort of casting of the United States itself as the indispensable nation, going back to Madeleine Albright. So I just want to ask as the final question of that is, if the United States viewed itself differently, if the United States, say, wasn't leaning in to help protect Ukraine right now, I imagine the outcome of the war would look a lot different. Doesn't that kind of meet the dictionary definition of indispensable?
Well, perhaps we're going to disagree on this point. I think the record shows that inflated claims about our influence and about our capacity to direct events in the world leads to disaster. Where is the proof? Well, the proof is in the behavior of the United States. An example, the behavior of the United States after 9/11. When we launched the folly of the global war on terrorism, which has cost our country dearly in blood, in treasure, and perhaps at least as important in creating instability in our own democracy. We can't afford any more of that. And therefore, we need to think about what a more prudent and realistic way of dealing in the world might be.
Professor Andrew Bacevich, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.